The Kentucky bloodbath of 1891, Old Man Harlan hunted. 14 deputies who burned his blind daughter alive. The bloodiest act of vengeance in Kentucky, mountain history, and the most devastating campaign of retribution the Cumberland Highlands had ever witnessed from a father avenging the murder of his child. This is the true story of Old Man Harlan. Our story begins in the rugged mountain section of Harlan County, Kentucky, in the shadow of Black Mountain, known throughout the region as one of the most isolated and fiercely independent corners of the state. The Cumberland Mountains rise here in ancient folds of sandstone and coal, their hollows sheltering families who had carved lives from wilderness and who had defended those lives against all who threatened them. The people who settled these mountains came seeking freedom from interference, and their descendants maintained that spirit through decades of conflict with authorities, who never understood that these hills had their own laws, their own justice, their own ways of handling matters that outsiders had no business involving themselves in. You see, in Harlan County in 1891, the bonds between father and daughter were sacred, but the bond between a father and a helpless child was something more, something that the mountain people recognized as approaching the divine. A daughter who could not see, who depended entirely on her father's protection, who trusted him to be her eyes in a world of darkness. That daughter occupied a place in her father's heart that nothing else could fill. To harm such a child was to commit an act so monstrous that no punishment the law could devise would ever be sufficient. To kill her was to invite a response that transcended ordinary vengeance. The conflict between local law enforcement and the mountain communities had been building for generations by the time our story begins. The timber companies had begun their assault on the great forests that covered these mountains, bringing new tensions to a region that had long governed itself. The deputies who enforced order in Harlan County often served the interests of these companies rather than the people, using their badges to intimidate and control communities that refused to submit quietly to the stripping of their land and their independence. The man who would become known throughout Kentucky simply as Old Man Harlan was born Jeremiah Solomon Harlan in 1831, in a cabin on the banks of Martin's Fork that his grandfather had built with his own hands in the years before Kentucky achieved statehood. He was the third of 7 children born to Ezekiel and Ruth Harlan, a family that had given its name to the county itself, that had been among the first settlers to carve homesteads from the wilderness of southeastern Kentucky. The fierce protectiveness that defined his character was evident from childhood, a willingness to defend those he loved that would later prove capable of things no one could have imagined. That's right. Jeremiah Harlan had grown up in a world where family was everything, where the protection of the vulnerable was the highest duty any man could fulfill, where a father's role included defending his children against any threat regardless of the cost. He had learned early that the world was dangerous, that those who could not protect themselves needed champions, that strength existed to shield weakness. These lessons shaped everything he would later become. His childhood had been marked by the rhythms of farm life, the endless cycle of planting and harvesting that sustained families who lived close to the land. He had learned to work from the time he could walk, had absorbed the understanding that survival required effort, that nothing was given freely, that a man's worth was measured by how well he provided for and protected those who depended on him. He developed early the iron will that mountain life required, a determination that would sustain him through tragedies that would have destroyed weaker spirits. His marriage to a woman named Martha Jane Hensley in 1855 had been a love match that united 2 of the most respected families in the Martin's Fork community. Martha was known throughout the Hollow for her kindness and her skill as a healer, a woman whose knowledge of herbs and medicines made her essential when sickness came to the community. Together they built a life on land that Jeremiah's father had given them, raising crops and children with the devotion that mountain families brought to everything they did. The children came steadily through the years that followed, 8 of them in all, 5 boys and 3 girls. The Harlan homestead became a prosperous place by mountain standards, the combined efforts of parents and children producing results that their neighbors acknowledged with respect. Jeremiah was known throughout the community as a man who kept his word, whose work was always honest, who would help any neighbor in need, but who would not tolerate any threat to his family. The youngest child was a girl named Mercy, born in 1875, 16 years after her oldest sibling. She came into the world small and frail, struggling for life in her first weeks in ways that made her parents fear she would not survive. But she did survive, grew stronger with each passing month, developed into a child whose sweetness and joy made her the favorite of the entire family. It was not until she was nearly 2 years old that her parents realized she could not see. The blindness had been present from birth, the doctors said, though no one could explain its cause. Mercy would never see the mountains that surrounded her home, never see the faces of the family who loved her, never see the wildflowers that bloomed each spring, or the snow that covered the hollow each winter. She would live her entire life in darkness, dependent on others for guidance through a world she could only know through touch and sound and smell. Jeremiah's response to his daughter's blindness was not grief but determination. He would be her eyes, would guide her through the world she could not see, would ensure that her disability did not prevent her from living a full and happy life. He built paths with rope guides between the cabin and the barn, between the garden and the springhouse, allowing Mercy to navigate the homestead independently. He described everything to her in patient detail, painted word pictures of the world she could not see, gave her an understanding of her surroundings that was different from sight, but no less complete. By 1891, Mercy Harlan was 16 years old, a young woman whose beauty was remarked upon by everyone who met her despite her sightless eyes. She had her mother's dark hair and her father's strong features, moved through the world with a grace that belied her blindness, had developed abilities that seemed almost supernatural to those who did not understand how the other senses could compensate for the loss of sight. She could identify people by their footsteps, could navigate the hollow without assistance, could sense changes in weather that sighted people missed entirely. Her gifts extended beyond mere compensation for her disability. She had a voice that could make grown men weep when she sang the old hymns at church, a touch that could calm frightened animals and crying children, a presence that seemed to radiate peace and warmth. The neighbors who knew her said there was something angelic about Mercy Harlan, something that transcended ordinary human qualities, as if her blindness had opened doors to other ways of knowing that sighted people could never access. She had learned to read through touch, running her fingers over letters that Jeremiah had carved into wooden blocks, developing a system of raised symbols that allowed her to write messages to family members. She could spin thread and weave cloth by feel alone, producing work that was indistinguishable from that of sighted weavers. She could cook and clean and perform most household tasks, had developed techniques that allowed her to function independently in ways that amazed visitors who expected helplessness. But her greatest gift was her spirit, an unquenchable joy that seemed impossible given her circumstances. She did not pity herself for her blindness, did not complain about what she could not do, focused instead on what she could do, and did it with enthusiasm. Her laughter filled the cabin, her songs drifted across the hollow, her presence made every gathering brighter. Those who knew her said they sometimes forgot she was blind, so complete was her engagement with the world around her. Her relationship with her father was the foundation of her life. Jeremiah had been her constant companion since infancy, had devoted himself to ensuring that her blindness did not limit her existence, had become not just her father, but her eyes, her guide, her protector against a world that could be cruel to those who were different. The bond between them was deeper than ordinary parent-child relationships, forged by dependence and devotion, by years of shared experiences and mutual trust. Jeremiah was 60 years old that year, his hair gone white, his face weathered by 6 decades of mountain life, his body still strong from a lifetime of labor. His older children had established their own households throughout the region, leaving only Mercy at home with her aging parents. Martha had died 2 years before, taken by a fever that no healing knowledge could cure, and Mercy had become everything to her father, the last child remaining, the one who needed him most, the one whose protection was his sacred duty. Now, to understand what happened in the fall of 1891, you need to understand the particular circumstances that had made the Harlan family targets for the county sheriff's attention. That's right. A new sheriff had been elected in Harlan County, a man named Cornelius Brock, who had risen to power with the backing of the timber companies that were rapidly acquiring land throughout the region. Brock was 45 years old, a lowland man who viewed the mountain people with contempt and who saw in their resistance to timber operations an obstacle to be crushed. The conflict between Sheriff Brock and Jeremiah Harlan had been building for months. Jeremiah had refused to sell his timber rights to the company that Brock represented, had encouraged his neighbors to do the same, had spoken at gatherings where resistance to the timber interests was organized. His voice carried weight in the community, and the company had noticed. Brock had received instructions to find a way to silence Jeremiah Harlan, to make an example that would discourage others from following his lead. The opportunity came in October 1891, when a timber company surveyor was found dead on a road outside the town of Harlan. Suspicion fell on men who had been vocal in their opposition to the companies, and someone suggested that Jeremiah Harlan might have been involved. The accusation was false, manufactured by men who wanted him silenced, but Sheriff Brock was not interested in truth. He was interested in results, and he saw in the accusation an opportunity to deal with a troublesome opponent. And that's when the nightmare began to unfold. You see, the morning of October 15th, 1891, had started like any other fall day on Martin's Fork. Jeremiah had left before dawn to help a neighbor with a difficult harvest, leaving Mercy alone in the cabin with instructions to stay inside until he returned. It was one of the few times he had left her alone since Martha's death, a necessity he had tried to avoid, but that circumstances had required. He expected to return by midday, expected to find Mercy safe in the cabin where she had spent her entire life. Sheriff Brock arrived at the Harlan homestead with 14 deputies, a force far larger than any legitimate investigation would have required. They found only Mercy, sitting on the porch of the cabin, her sightless eyes turned toward the sound of their approach. The deputies surrounded her, demanded to know where her father was, accused her of hiding information about his whereabouts and his involvement in the surveyor's death. Mercy responded with the dignity that had always characterized her, stated that her father had gone to help a neighbor, that she knew nothing about any killing, that she would be happy to relay any message when her father returned. Her calm demeanor, her refusal to show fear despite being surrounded by armed men she could not see, seemed to infuriate rather than mollify the deputies. They had expected intimidation to work, and her composure challenged their sense of power. What happened next would be remembered in Harlan County for generations as the most horrific act ever committed by local law enforcement, a crime so terrible that even those who had no love for the Harlan family were devastated. Sheriff Brock, frustrated by his inability to find Jeremiah and enraged by what he perceived as Mercy's defiance, decided to leave a message that would not be misunderstood. He ordered his deputies to set fire to the cabin. The men hesitated at first, understood that what they were being asked to do crossed a line that should never be crossed, but Brock insisted, threatened those who refused with consequences they feared, and one by one they complied. They spread lamp oil on the porch and the walls, ignited the accelerant, stood back to watch as flames began to consume the structure that had been home to Harlan families for 3 generations. Mercy was inside when the fire started, had retreated into the cabin when she sensed the hostility of the men surrounding her. She heard the sounds of liquid being poured, smelled the kerosene that had no place near a dwelling, felt the heat before she understood what was happening. By the time she realized the cabin was burning, flames blocked every exit, surrounded her with a wall of heat and smoke that her blindness made impossible to navigate. She screamed for help, her voice rising above the roar of the flames, her hands reaching for exits that no longer existed. The deputies stood watching, some troubled by what they were witnessing, others seemingly entertained by the spectacle of a blind girl trying to escape a burning building. Sheriff Brock prevented anyone from offering assistance, stated that this was what happened to families who defied the law, ensured that no one intervened as the screaming continued, and then finally mercifully stopped. Jeremiah Harlan saw the smoke from 2 miles away, knew with immediate certainty that something terrible had happened at his home. He ran toward the column of black smoke rising above the trees, ran faster than a 60-year-old man should have been able to run, arrived at his homestead to find only smoldering ruins where his cabin had stood. The deputies had already gone, leaving behind only destruction and the charred remains of his daughter. He found Mercy's body in what had been her bedroom, curled into a position that suggested she had been trying to hide from flames that found her anyway. The fire had been so intense that little remained, but enough remained for a father to recognize his child, enough to understand what she had endured in her final moments. He knelt beside her remains and wept, held what was left of his daughter, screamed his grief into a sky that offered no answer. The official report filed by Sheriff Brock claimed that the fire had been accidental, that a lamp had overturned when Mercy panicked at the deputy's approach, that the officers had tried to rescue her but had been prevented by the intensity of the flames. The report made no mention of the kerosene, did not acknowledge that the fire had been deliberately set, treated Mercy's death as a tragic accident rather than murder. No charges were filed against any of the deputies. No investigation was conducted into the circumstances of the fire. But for Jeremiah Harlan, the matter had only begun. You see, the death of Mercy destroyed something in Jeremiah that could never be repaired. She had been his last child at home, the one who needed him most, the one whose protection had been his sacred duty since the moment he learned she could not see. He had failed her, had left her alone when danger came, had not been there to shield her from men who would burn a blind girl alive, to send a message to her father. The guilt was unbearable, but beneath the guilt was something harder, something that demanded action rather than mere suffering. The grief that consumed Jeremiah in the days following Mercy's death was unlike anything he had experienced, deeper than the loss of his wife, more devastating than any hardship the mountains had ever imposed. He buried his daughter in the family cemetery, on the ridge above where the cabin had stood, dug the grave himself because he could not bear to have anyone else touch her remains, spoke words over the grave that no one else heard. And as he stood beside that fresh mound of earth, he made a vow that would define whatever remained of his existence. He would kill them. Every deputy who had participated in the burning, every man who had poured kerosene or struck the match or stood watching while his blind daughter burned to death. He would hunt them one by one, would find them wherever they went, would ensure that each experienced something of what Mercy had experienced before the end came. 14 deputies had come to his property that morning. 14 deputies would die before Jeremiah was finished. And that vow, spoken in the silence of a cemetery where his daughter now rested, would be fulfilled beyond anything Jeremiah himself could have imagined. The planning process took 4 weeks, during which Jeremiah gathered the information he needed while appearing to be consumed by grief. The appearance was not entirely false. The grief was real and overwhelming, present in every moment of every day. But beneath the grief was something harder, something colder, a determination that grew stronger with each passing day. The same focus that had made him successful as a farmer and as a father would now be turned to a different purpose. He learned the names of every deputy who had accompanied Sheriff Brock to his property, identified them through careful questioning of neighbors who had seen the party ride past, who had heard rumors about what had happened at the Harlan homestead. He studied their habits, their routines, their vulnerabilities. He prepared weapons and supplies, planned routes and contingencies, approached the task with the methodical patience that 6 decades of mountain life had developed. His first kill came in mid-November 1891, 4 weeks after Mercy's death. The target was a deputy named William Creech, who had been identified by witnesses as the man who had actually struck the match that started the fire, whose hand had brought the flame to the kerosene-soaked wood. Creech was found dead in his home, burned beyond recognition in a fire that had clearly been deliberately set. The message was unmistakable. The killer was recreating the death that had been inflicted on Mercy Harlan. The killing of William Creech sent shockwaves through the sheriff's department. The manner of death, burning that echoed what had been done to Mercy, made clear that this was not random violence, but targeted revenge. The deputies who had participated in the cabin fire understood immediately that they were being hunted, that someone was seeking retribution for what they had done. Fear began to spread through their ranks. The second killing came 2 weeks later, targeting another deputy who had participated in the burning. This man, named Thomas Howard, was found in similar circumstances, his cabin reduced to ashes with his body inside. The pattern was unmistakable now. The killer was ensuring that each victim experienced something of what Mercy had experienced, burned alive in their own homes with no possibility of escape. The third and fourth killings came in quick succession in December 1891, demonstrating that Jeremiah's campaign was accelerating. Both victims were deputies from the Brock force, both killed by fire in circumstances that required planning and patience. The sheriff's department began to realize that they faced something unprecedented, a killer with the skill and determination to find them wherever they were and to inflict upon them the fate they had inflicted upon a blind girl. That's right. Jeremiah continued his campaign through the winter of 1891 to 1892, striking with a regularity that kept his enemies constantly off balance. The fifth deputy died in late December, found in the ruins of his barn where he had apparently sought refuge from the fire that consumed his house. The fire had started in both buildings simultaneously, trapping him between two infernos, giving him no escape from flames that came from every direction. Witnesses reported hearing his screams for nearly 10 minutes before silence finally fell. The sixth was discovered in early January in the ashes of the boarding house where he had fled after the earlier killings, taking 3 innocent people with him in a fire that Jeremiah had intended for him alone. The unintended deaths troubled Jeremiah deeply, caused him to adjust his methods, ensured that subsequent killings would be more precisely targeted. He was not a murderer of innocents. He was an executioner of the guilty, and the distinction mattered to him even in the depths of his grief and rage. He began to take additional precautions after the boarding house fire, watching potential targets for longer periods to ensure that his strikes would not harm bystanders. The patience this required extended the time between killings, but ensured that each subsequent death claimed only the intended victim. The mountain people who learned of his care in this matter respected him for it, saw in his precision a moral code that elevated his campaign above mere murder. The seventh and eighth died in late January, killed on the same night in fires set at opposite ends of the county. The coordination demonstrated that Jeremiah had recruited help, that his campaign was not the work of one man, but of a family seeking collective vengeance for their murdered sister. His sons, who had loved mercy as deeply as their father had, participated in operations that required multiple people, ensuring that no deputy could feel safe regardless of precautions taken. The terror that spread through the remaining deputies was unlike anything they had experienced. These were men who had burned a blind girl alive, who had stood watching her die without lifting a finger to help, who had believed themselves untouchable because of their badges and their connections. Now they understood that death was hunting them in the form of fire, that their homes offered no safety, that every spark and flame was a potential harbinger of their end. Some deputies abandoned their families entirely, reasoning that the killer targeted men in their homes and that their presence endangered their wives and children. Others brought their families with them into hiding, moving constantly from place to place, never remaining anywhere long enough to be found. The department that had burned Mercy Harlan alive was discovering that such cruelty had consequences they had never imagined possible. Sheriff Brock tried to maintain order, tried to project confidence that the killer would be caught, but his authority was crumbling with each new death. Deputies refused to serve, resigned their positions, fled the county entirely. The force that had numbered 14 men on the day they burned the Harlan cabin had dwindled to 3 by February, and those 3 refused to leave the stone building where Brock had established his headquarters. Each killing was executed with care that reflected Jeremiah's intimate knowledge of the mountains and his patience as a man who had survived 6 decades in unforgiving terrain. He tracked his prey for days before striking, learned their habits and their vulnerabilities, waited for the perfect moment when they would be alone and undefended. The skills of survival that the mountains had taught him were now applied to a deadlier purpose. The terror that Jeremiah created spread through the remaining deputies like a plague. Men who had burned a blind girl alive now understood that death was hunting them in the form of fire, that their homes offered no safety, that every spark and flame was a potential harbinger of their end. Some fled the county, hoping that distance would provide protection. Others abandoned their homes entirely, sleeping in different locations each night, never remaining still long enough to be targeted. The 9th killing came in February, targeting one of the deputies who had fled to a neighboring county. Jeremiah tracked him there, waited for the opportunity that patience always provided, burned him in a shed where he had been hiding, believing himself safe because he was far from Harlan County. The message was clear. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide, no safety anywhere for men who had burned Mercy Harlan alive. The 10th and 11th killings followed in quick succession, each victim burned in circumstances that echoed the cabin fire. The 12th came in March, the 13th in early April. The pattern was relentless, the pace steady, the determination absolute. Jeremiah was not merely killing men, but delivering a message that everyone in the region understood. What had been done to his daughter would be repaid in kind, measured out one death at a time until the debt was fully paid. The investigation into the killings struggled against an enemy it could not comprehend. Investigators were brought in from outside the county, men who did not share the local sympathies that complicated the case. They quickly identified the pattern, understood that Jeremiah Harlan was the likely killer, mounted efforts to capture him that consistently failed. Jeremiah moved through the mountains like a ghost, knew every path and hollow, every hiding place that the Cumberland Highlands contained. The community that had watched the killings unfold provided no assistance to investigators. The mountain people understood what had been done to Mercy, understood that the law had failed to provide any justice, understood that Jeremiah was doing what the system should have done, but would not. They refused to provide information, claimed ignorance of his whereabouts, created obstacles that investigators found impossible to overcome. The wall of silence was absolute. The 14th and final killing came on October 15, 1892, 1 year to the day after Mercy's death. The target was Sheriff Cornelius Brock himself, the man who had ordered the burning, who had stood watching while a blind girl screamed and died, who had filed the false report that called her murder an accident. Brock had barricaded himself in a stone building he believed to be fireproof, surrounded by the few men still willing to serve as deputies. He was wrong about that safety. Jeremiah reached him despite every precaution, found a way past defenses that would have stopped anyone less determined. He did not burn the stone building, which was indeed resistant to fire. Instead, he entered it in the early hours of an October morning, bypassed guards who had grown complacent, reached the room where Brock slept, surrounded by weapons he never had the chance to use. What passed between them in those final moments was known only to Jeremiah and to the man he killed. But when Brock's body was found the next morning, it was clear that his death had not been quick. He had been bound, had been doused with kerosene, had been forced to understand exactly why he was dying before the match was struck. The fire that consumed him was contained to his body alone, controlled with precision that demonstrated both skill and determination. The final debt had been paid, and then, as suddenly as it had begun, the killing stopped. Jeremiah Harlan was arrested 1 week after Brock's death, surrendering voluntarily to authorities who had been unable to capture him during the year of his campaign. He did not resist, did not attempt to flee, seemed almost relieved that the killing was over. The rage that had driven him for 12 months had burned itself out, leaving only exhaustion and an emptiness that would never be filled. His daughter was still dead, would always be dead, and no amount of vengeance could bring her back. The trial of Jeremiah Old Man Harlan became the most sensational criminal proceeding in Kentucky history, drawing attention from across the nation and spectators who traveled from distant states to witness the case. The courtroom was packed every day, with crowds gathering outside to follow updates from those fortunate enough to secure seats inside. Newspapers sent reporters from as far as New York and Chicago, making Jeremiah's story known to millions who had never heard of Harlan County or Martin's Fork. The scene inside the courtroom was remarkable for its contrasts. The defendant was a weathered mountain man of 61 years, his white hair and lined face speaking of a lifetime of hard work and recent grief. He sat quietly through testimony that described his killings in graphic detail, showed no reaction when witnesses identified him as the man they had seen near crime scenes, maintained a composure that some found chilling and others found dignified. The spectators included journalists from across the nation, curious observers who had traveled hundreds of miles, and supporters from the mountain community who packed the galleries whenever space permitted. The latter group was notable for its composition. Fathers who understood what Jeremiah had experienced, parents who knew what they would do if someone burned their child alive, people who saw in him not a murderer, but an instrument of justice that the official system had refused to provide. The prosecution presented its case methodically, connecting Jeremiah to the deaths through evidence that demonstrated planning and determination. They called witnesses who had seen him near crime scenes, who had observed him watching potential victims, who had noticed an old man where no old man should have been. They presented evidence of the fires, their deliberate nature, their connection to the defendant. They built a technical case that was impressive in its scope. The prosecutor, a state attorney named Charles Morrison, understood the difficulty of his position. He could not afford to appear sympathetic to a defendant who had killed 14 men, but he also could not ignore the circumstances that had driven Jeremiah to action. His strategy focused on the killings themselves, on their calculated nature, on the planning that had gone into each one. He argued that whatever grievance Jeremiah had suffered, it did not justify the systematic execution of men who had families of their own. But the trial became something more than a murder prosecution. The defense, led by a lawyer named William Patterson, who had taken the case without fee, used the proceedings to put Sheriff Brock and his department on trial. He called witnesses who testified to the circumstances of Mercy's death, to the cabin fire that had been deliberately set, to the deputies who had stood watching while a blind girl burned to death. The testimony about Mercy's death shocked the courtroom and the nation. Witnesses described the kerosene being poured, the match being struck, the flames engulfing a cabin where a blind girl was trapped. They described Mercy's screams, which had been heard by neighbors a quarter-mile away, her desperate attempts to find an exit in a building she knew intimately, but that had become a maze of flame. They described the deputies standing watching, some troubled but none intervening, prevented from offering assistance by a sheriff who wanted to send a message. One witness, a neighbor woman who had arrived during the fire, described seeing Mercy at a window, her hands pressed against glass that was already too hot to break, her sightless eyes seeming to search for help that would not come. The image haunted everyone who heard it, became the emotional center of the trial, made visceral what the prosecution's technical evidence could not convey. Mercy Harlan had been 16 years old, had been blind since birth, had been burned alive for no reason except that her father had opposed the timber companies. The defense attorney's closing argument focused not on denying what Jeremiah had done, but on explaining why he had done it. He described a father whose blind daughter had been burned alive by deputies, who faced no consequences for their actions, whose attempts to seek justice through legal channels had been blocked by the same interests that had ordered Mercy's death. He asked the jury to consider what any father would do when faced with such loss and such complete absence of accountability. The jury deliberated for 6 days, the longest deliberation in Kentucky legal history, suggesting that the decision was far from straightforward. When they finally returned, their verdict reflected the complexity of the case and the community's sympathy for a father who had lost his child. Guilty of voluntary manslaughter on 14 counts, with a recommendation for the minimum possible sentence. The verdict was a repudiation of the system that had burned Mercy Harlan alive and had protected those responsible. It acknowledged that while Jeremiah had committed terrible acts, the acts committed against his daughter were equally terrible and had received no official censure. The judge, a man named Robert Harrison, who had listened to testimony with evident emotion, sentenced Jeremiah to 14 concurrent terms of 5 years each, with eligibility for parole after 3 years. Jeremiah Harlan served 4 years at the Kentucky State Penitentiary before being released on parole in the spring of 1897. He was 66 years old, had spent the years since Mercy's death either hunting the men who had killed her or serving time for that hunting. He returned to Harlan County, to the mountains he had never wanted to leave, to a piece of land where only a stone foundation marked where his cabin had once stood. The years following his release were quiet ones, marked by a solitude that those who knew him understood was grief rather than choice. His surviving children offered to take him in, to care for him in his old age, but he refused. Built a small cabin near the ruins of the old one, lived alone with his memories and his loss. The community accepted his return without judgment, understood that what he had done, however terrible, had grown from a love and an injustice that demanded response. He visited Mercy's grave every day, walking the path to the cemetery regardless of weather, sitting beside her headstone and talking to her as if she could hear. He told her about the wildflowers that bloomed each spring, described the colors she had never seen, painted word pictures of the world as he had done throughout her life. The conversations were private, heard only by the wind and the birds, a father's ongoing dialogue with a daughter who would remain forever 16. He died peacefully in his sleep in the winter of 1903, found in his cabin by a grandson who had come to check on him after a heavy snowfall. He was 72 years old, had lived 12 years since Mercy's death, had never recovered from the loss that had defined his final years. He was buried beside her in the family cemetery on the ridge, the simple stones that marked their graves bearing only their names and dates. The aftermath of Jeremiah Harlan's campaign reshaped law enforcement practices in the Kentucky mountains for a generation. The exposure of what had been done to Mercy, which came out in devastating detail during the trial, generated public outrage that could not be ignored. The timber companies that had backed Brock found themselves facing scrutiny they had always avoided, their control over local sheriffs suddenly a liability rather than an asset. Newspapers that had previously ignored or dismissed the concerns of mountain communities now published editorials demanding reform. The details of Mercy's death, repeated across front pages throughout the state and beyond, created images that could not be forgotten. Politicians who had supported the company-controlled sheriffs found themselves facing questions they could not answer, their connections to the timber interests suddenly toxic. Congressional representatives from Kentucky received letters from constituents demanding action. State legislators convened hearings that examined law enforcement practices across the mountain counties, hearing testimony that shocked even those who had suspected problems. The accumulated evidence created a picture of systematic abuse that could no longer be ignored. The reforms that followed were significant, though they came too late for Mercy and for the many others who had suffered at the hands of company-controlled deputies. Investigations were launched into sheriff's departments throughout the timber counties, revealing patterns of abuse that extended far beyond Harlan County. Deputies who had participated in similar crimes found themselves facing scrutiny, some fleeing rather than answering questions about their past. The political machines that had protected men like Brock found their power challenged by reformers who used the Harlan case as evidence of what needed to change. Elections that had been controlled by company interests became competitive for the first time in decades, as voters who had been intimidated into silence found their voices. The treatment of the disabled came under particular scrutiny. The burning of a blind girl had shocked the conscience of the nation, had demonstrated how vulnerable the most helpless members of society were when authority was exercised without restraint. Procedures were established requiring special consideration for those who could not protect themselves, recognizing that some victims needed more protection rather than less. Training programs were developed that emphasized the particular vulnerabilities of the disabled, the need for restraint when dealing with those who could not flee or defend themselves. The corporate control of law enforcement became a subject of public debate in ways it had never been before. The understanding that Sheriff Brock had acted on orders from timber interests, that Mercy had been killed to silence opposition to land acquisition, generated outrage that extended far beyond the mountains. Reformers used the case as evidence that corporations should not be permitted to control the instruments of public safety, that sheriffs should serve the people rather than private interests. The cultural impact extended beyond policy changes. The Jeremiah Harlan case became a symbol throughout Kentucky of what could happen when law enforcement forgot its proper role, when those charged with protecting citizens instead murdered the most innocent among them. Parents told their children the story as a warning about the abuse of power, as a reminder that authority could be corrupted, as an example of what fathers were capable of when their children were harmed. The grave site where Jeremiah and Mercy rest together became a place of pilgrimage for those who remembered the story, visited by people who wanted to pay respects to a father and daughter whose bond had transcended death, whose story spoke to something fundamental about love and protection. The stones that mark their resting places are weathered now by more than a century of mountain weather, but the names carved into them remain legible. The songs that emerged from the Old Man Harlan story varied widely in their approach and message. Some were straightforward ballads that recounted the events in chronological order, from the burning through the campaign to the trial. These songs celebrated his determination, described his killings in terms that bordered on admiration, portrayed him as a symbol of fatherly love pushed beyond all limits by an injustice too great to bear. The first songs appeared within months of the trial's conclusion, composed by local musicians who understood the significance of what had happened. These early ballads were simple, built on traditional melodies with new words that told the Harlan story in terms that mountain audiences would understand. They spread through the region by word of mouth, learned by one community and carried to the next, modified and embellished as they traveled until multiple versions existed throughout Appalachia. One popular ballad described the cabin fire where Mercy died, painting a vivid picture of a blind girl trapped in flames while deputies stood watching. The song captured the horror of those final moments, the smoke filling lungs that screamed for air, the flames that found her despite her desperate search for escape. It portrayed Jeremiah's arrival too late to save her, his discovery of her body in the ruins, his transformation from grieving father to avenging fury. The song's description of Mercy at the window became its most famous passage, capturing the image of a blind girl pressing her hands against glass, too hot to break, her sightless eyes searching for help that would not come. The detail had come from a neighbor's testimony at the trial, and its inclusion in the song ensured that the image would persist in community memory long after the trial itself was forgotten. The verses describing the fire became iconic, repeated in countless retellings. They captured the kerosene being poured by men who knew what they were doing, the match struck by a hand that would later burn in turn, the screams that echoed across the hollow until they finally stopped. They described the deputies standing watching, their faces lit by firelight, their humanity absent in the presence of such cruelty. Another song told the story from the deputies' perspective, describing their growing terror as their colleagues died one by one around them. Each burned in a manner that echoed what they had done to Mercy. This song was darker than most, capturing the fear that must have consumed men who understood that death was hunting them in the form of fire, that every flame was a potential grave. It described their attempts to flee, their efforts to hide, their final understanding that Jeremiah Harlan would find them regardless. The song imagined their final moments, the understanding that came too late, that what they had done was monstrous, the regret that served no purpose when flames were already consuming them. It offered no sympathy for these men, but rather held them up as examples of what happened when cruelty met its answer, when those who burned the innocent were themselves burned in turn. A third song focused on the relationship between father and daughter, on the bond that had been forged by Mercy's blindness and strengthened by the years of care that Jeremiah had provided. This song was more tender than the others, avoiding the violence of the ballads in favor of a meditation on love and protection, on what it means to be someone's eyes in a world of darkness, on the devastation that follows when the one you have sworn to protect is murdered in your absence. A fourth song addressed the timber companies directly, condemning the corporate interests that had ordered Mercy's murder and that had protected the deputies who carried it out. This song connected the Harlan story to broader struggles against exploitation, portrayed Jeremiah not merely as a grieving father, but as a fighter against injustice, linked his personal vendetta to the collective resistance that was building throughout the mountains. The most famous of all the Old Man Harlan songs was composed several decades after the events by a professional musician who traveled to Harlan County to research the story. This comprehensive ballad told the complete narrative with skill and emotional power, becoming a standard in the Appalachian music repertoire. It has been recorded by numerous artists over the years, carrying Jeremiah's story to audiences who never knew his name, but who recognized in his actions something universal about love and vengeance and the bonds between fathers and daughters. Historians who have studied the Old Man Harlan case have reached varying conclusions about its significance and meaning. Some have analyzed it as an example of resistance to corporate control during the era of timber and coal extraction, arguing that the sheriff's actions were part of a broader pattern of using law enforcement to suppress opposition to resource exploitation. They note that Jeremiah was targeted not because of any crime, but because he had opposed the timber companies, that Mercy was killed as a message to others who might resist. These scholars have traced the connections between the Harlan case and the broader patterns of corporate dominance that characterize the Appalachian resource extraction economy. The timber companies that moved through Kentucky in the late 19th century stripped the land of its forests and its people of their independence, using political power and physical force to overcome resistance. Sheriff Brock was merely the most extreme example of lawmen who served corporate interests rather than public safety. The economic analysis reveals why the timber companies were willing to commit murder to maintain control. The forests of eastern Kentucky represented enormous wealth, and any organized resistance threatened to reduce the profits that extraction could generate. Landowners who refused to sell their timber rights, who encouraged their neighbors to do the same, posed an existential threat to the company's business model. The companies responded with violence administered through sheriffs who were effectively private security forces wearing public badges. Others have focused on the particular vulnerability of the disabled in law enforcement contexts, using Mercy's death as evidence of attitudes that viewed those with disabilities as less than fully human. The deputies who burned her showed no recognition of her helplessness, no restraint in the face of obvious vulnerability, treated her blindness as irrelevant to their actions. The failure to charge anyone with her death reflected acceptance of violence against those who could not defend themselves. Medical historians have examined the understanding of blindness in the late 19th century, noting that attitudes toward disability were often characterized by a mixture of pity and contempt. The blind were frequently institutionalized, segregated from society, treated as burdens rather than as full human beings. Mercy's life within her family, her integration into household and community activities, was unusual for the time and reflected the mountain culture's different approach to disability. The psychological analysis has examined Jeremiah's response to his daughter's murder, the transformation from grieving father to methodical killer. Researchers have noted the precision of his campaign, the patience with which he tracked his victims, the symbolic resonance of killing each deputy by fire as they had killed Mercy. The choice of method was not merely practical but meaningful, ensuring that each victim experienced something of what Mercy had experienced before the end came. The grief response in parents who lose children to violence has been extensively studied, and Jeremiah's reaction fits patterns that have been documented in other cases. The sense of failure, the guilt at not being present to protect, the rage at those responsible, all of these elements were present in his case. His campaign can be understood as an attempt to transform helpless grief into purposeful action, to create meaning from meaningless tragedy. Legal scholars have analyzed the jury's verdict as an example of jury nullification, the practice by which juries reject the strict application of law in favor of what they perceive as justice. The evidence against Jeremiah was overwhelming. The killings clearly premeditated, the legal definition of murder clearly satisfied. Yet the jury chose to convict on manslaughter rather than murder, and recommended a sentence far below what the law would have allowed for 14 deaths. You see, what Jeremiah Harlan did cannot be justified by any conventional legal or moral framework. He killed 14 men, each one burned in a manner that echoed his daughter's death, each execution planned and carried out with determination that allowed no mercy. The fact that his victims had participated in Mercy's murder does not eliminate the fact that he acted as judge, jury, and executioner, taking lives that were not his to take. And yet his story cannot be simply condemned, reduced to a tale of criminality that teaches only the obvious lesson that murder is wrong. He was a father whose blind daughter had been burned alive by deputies who stood watching her die, whose death had been officially declared an accident, whose killers had faced no consequences from a system that was designed to protect the powerful rather than the innocent. What options did he have? What would any father do? His story challenges us to consider the relationship between law and justice, between what is legal and what is right. The burning of Mercy Harlan was legal in the sense that no one was prosecuted for it, that the official system treated it as an unfortunate accident. But the burning was not just. Mercy was a 16-year-old girl who had been blind since birth, who had harmed no one, who had been murdered to send a message to her father. Her death served no legitimate law enforcement purpose, was pure murder disguised as accident. The specific circumstances that produced the old man Harlan story, the combination of corporate control over law enforcement, the complete absence of accountability for official violence, The vulnerability of the disabled in the face of power have not entirely disappeared. Similar abuses continue to occur, continue to generate responses that the official world condemns as vigilantism, continue to raise questions about what citizens can do when those charged with protecting them become their murderers. The descendants of the Harlan family still live in those Kentucky mountains, carrying the memory of Jeremiah and Mercy through the generations. Family reunions include visits to the cemetery where they rest together, moments of reflection on lives that encompassed both terrible tragedy and terrible vengeance. The story is told to each new generation, ensuring that what happened will not be forgotten. The mountains of Harlan County remain today, much as they were in Jeremiah's time, ancient and patient and indifferent to human drama. The hollow where the Harlan cabin once stood still shows traces of the foundation, stones that have remained in place for more than a century, marking where a blind girl was burned alive. The land has never been developed, left as a kind of memorial by descendants who could not bear to build on ground so soaked in tragedy. The story of Old Man Harlan endures because it speaks to something fundamental in the human experience. It is the story of love between parent and child, of the special bond that forms when a child depends completely on a parent for protection. It is the story of failure and guilt, of a father who was not there when his daughter needed him most. It is the story of vengeance and its aftermath, of the emptiness that remains when the killing is done and the grief still has not healed. What about you, my friend? Would you make that journey to stand where Jeremiah stood, to see the cemetery where he and Mercy rest together, to walk the hollow where a blind girl was burned alive and a father was transformed by grief into something terrible? Would you breathe the mountain air, feel the wind that has blown through these ridges for millennia, sense the presence of history that lingers in certain places? The journey is not easy, the roads are narrow and winding, and the cemetery is difficult to find without a guide who knows the way. But those who make the effort say it is worth it, that standing in that place brings something into focus that cannot be captured in words or photographs. The drive from Lexington takes most of a day, winding through mountains that seem to rise higher with each passing mile. The paved roads give way to gravel, and the gravel gives way to dirt tracks that require careful navigation. Modern vehicles struggle on terrain that horses once crossed easily, and the final miles must often be covered on foot, following paths that only the knowing can identify among the overgrown forest. The people who live in the surrounding hollows still know the Harlan story, still speak of Jeremiah and Mercy when strangers ask about the history of the region. They will point the way to the cemetery, will share their own memories or the memories their grandparents passed down, will help visitors understand the context that makes the story comprehensible. They do not judge Jeremiah for what he did, do not condemn him as a murderer, see in his actions the same fierce protective love that they recognize in themselves. The cemetery sits on a ridge above Martin's Fork, sheltered by trees that have grown tall in the century since the last burial there. The stones are weathered by time and mountain weather, but the names carved into them remain visible. Jeremiah and Mercy rest side by side, father and daughter reunited in death, their graves maintained by descendants who ensure that they will not be forgotten. Standing at those graves, looking out over the mountains that both of them knew throughout their lives, one can almost feel their presence lingering in the wind that rustles through the trees. They are gone, of course, have been gone for more than a century now, but what passed between them remains, preserved in memory and song and story. The questions they force us to ask about love and protection and the limits of what any father should be expected to endure have no easy answers. The hollow where the cabin once stood has changed little since 1891, still bearing the scars of that terrible fire. The foundation stones remain in place, marking where a blind girl was burned alive, where flames consumed everything Jeremiah had built over decades of labor. The community has preserved the site as a kind of memorial, refusing to allow development that would erase the physical traces of what happened. On the anniversary of Mercy's death, October 15th, family members sometimes gather at the cemetery to remember what happened. They share stories about Jeremiah and Mercy, keeping their memory alive through the telling. They place flowers on the graves, tokens of respect for a father and daughter whose bond death could not sever. They stand in silence for a moment, acknowledging the tragedy and the response that shaped everything that followed, the mountains keep their secrets, holding the memory of Jeremiah and Mercy close, like they hold the morning mist and the evening shadows. Their story will continue to be told as long as people remember what happened in Harlan County during those terrible years, as long as fathers love their daughters with a devotion that defies law and logic, as long as systems fail and ordinary people find their own extraordinary ways to respond. They are gone now, dust mingling with the earth of the ridge where they were born and where they rest. But what happened between them echoes still through time and will continue to echo for generations yet to come. The lessons of their story remain relevant even today. The tension between corporate power and individual dignity has not disappeared, and the question of what citizens can do when official systems serve powerful interests rather than justice remains as urgent as ever. Jeremiah's answer, the taking of lives in response to the murder of his daughter, cannot be endorsed as a model for others to follow, but his story reminds us why such answers become possible, why the social contract can break down so completely that violence seems like the only remaining option. The vulnerability of the disabled continues to demand attention and protection. Although attitudes have improved since 1891, those who cannot see or hear or move freely remain at greater risk when authority is exercised without restraint. Mercy Harlan's death was possible because no one in power considered her blindness a reason for mercy, because her helplessness invited cruelty rather than protection. The reforms that followed her death addressed some of these problems, but the underlying challenges remain. And that, my friend, is the true story of Old Man Harlan, who hunted 14 lawmen after they burned his blind daughter Mercy alive in the cabin where she had spent her entire life in Harlan County, Kentucky, in the fall of 1891. A story of love and devastating loss, of patience and righteous fury, of justice found where the law would not provide it, and of a father who could not protect his daughter in life, but who avenged her in death. The story speaks to questions that have no comfortable answers, questions about the nature of justice and the limits of what any parent should be expected to endure. Jeremiah Harlan killed 14 men, committed acts that the law must condemn regardless of the circumstances that drove them. But he acted from love, from a bond with his daughter that had been forged by her dependence and his devotion, from a grief so profound that ordinary responses were impossible. The burning of each deputy in the manner that Mercy had been burned was not mere cruelty, but a kind of terrible justice, ensuring that each man experienced what he had inflicted before the end came. The message was unmistakable. Those who burn a blind girl alive will themselves burn, measured out one death at a time until the debt is paid in full. The mountain communities that knew his story and protected his whereabouts understood something that the official world could not comprehend. They understood that Mercy's death was murder that would never be punished through legal channels, that the system that should have protected her had instead killed her at corporate direction. They understood that Jeremiah's response, however terrible, grew from something sacred, from the bond between father and child that the mountain people recognized as the highest of all obligations. Their silence was not conspiracy, but compassion, not obstruction, but loyalty to values that mattered more than official law. The descendants of those communities still carry the memory, still tell the story to children who will never know the principles, but who will recognize in the narrative something true about love and loss and the lengths to which devotion will go. The mountains remember Jeremiah and Mercy, hold their story close like they hold the morning mist and the evening shadows, ensure that what happened will not be forgotten even as the physical traces disappear. A story of a father who devoted his life to being his daughter's eyes, who failed to protect her on one terrible day, who spent his remaining years ensuring that those responsible paid with their lives. The mountains remember, and through them, through the songs and stories that continue to be sung and told across these ancient Appalachian lands, so do we all, now and forever. As long as memory endures and people gather to hear tales of mountain justice and family honor and the fierce love between fathers and daughters that becomes something terrible when it is forced to witness the murder of innocence.